The last component in the process is costs. Take a look at your screen for several eligible costs. It is important to make sure all of your costs are documented and comply with appropriate guidelines. They must be reasonable and necessary to accomplish the work, directly tied to the repair or replacement of damage caused by the disaster event, and the work and documentation must show compliance with federal, state, and local laws, regulations, and policies, including deductions from duplication of benefits, such as insurance proceeds, salvage value, or purchase discounts. Now let's cover what is considered eligible costs for labor, equipment, materials, fees paid, and management costs. For labor, both force account and donated labor is eligible for emergency work and permanent work. An applicant does not get reimbursed for donated labor, but the donated labor can be used to offset that non-federal share. This is also true for donated equipment and materials. For budgeted employees, you can claim overtime and overtime benefits, but not straight time and straight time benefits for Category B, emergency protective measures. These type of employees are permanent employees and part-time or seasonal employees working during their normal season of employment. For unbudgeted employees, you can claim straight time and overtime, including benefits for Category B. These types of employees are essential employees called back from administrative leave, permanent employees funded from external sources, temporary employees hired to perform eligible work, and part-time or seasonal employees working outside their normal season of employment. To dive a little deeper into permanent work, if your project consists of permanent relocation, know that this may be an eligible cost. It will depend on its cost effectiveness and can be considered with roads, utilities, land acquisition, and engineering projects. If the project requires temporary relocation of essential services, this could also be an eligible cost following a cost comparison of alternate measures. If the project requires temporary relocation of essential services, this could also be an eligible cost following a cost comparison of alternate methods of providing the services. Lastly, if a structure has received damage that is less than 50% of its pre-disaster value, it will be repaired. If the structure received more than 50% damage, then it could be replaced. The damage has to be caused by the event and not a combination of the event and previous decline. It would also require a record showing the structure was maintained. Regardless of whether a structure is repaired or replaced, current codes and standards would apply. You may even want to look at mitigation options that could prevent such damages from happening in the future. When documenting labor costs, there are specific questions that must be answered. Who is the worker and what they did, when and where they worked and for how long, and how much the worker earned. This is required for internal employees, mutual aid, and donated services. Documentation that supports claimed labor costs includes timesheets, payroll records, payroll policy, and fringe benefits calculation. All of the information must be put in some type of organized manner, keeping any donated, regular, and overtime hours separate. If you already have a system that requires minimal modification to collect all of this data, that is acceptable. If you don't, you can use FEMA's Force Account Labor Summary Spreadsheet or Fringe Benefit Calculation Worksheet. Equipment costs are for equipment you own, lease, or purchase for necessary use in your recovery efforts. The equipment you own are normally reimbursed based on an hourly rate, whereas leased or rented equipment is based on the rental or lease agreement. The equipment documentation mirrors much of the labor documentation needed. Like labor, the documentation is needed for internal work, mutual aid, and donated equipment. Documentation that supports claimed equipment costs may be in the form of an equipment log or record sheet. And finally, a similar process is needed for materials used from stock for use in an event. You don't have to replace the items taken from stock to receive reimbursement. To establish cost, you can use the invoices for the stock previously purchased. If purchasing materials, please follow your procurement policy or the state procurement policy and be fully documented. Documentation that supports claimed material costs include the procurement policy, bids, purchase orders, invoices, and canceled checks. It is dependent on the purchases. Please check to see what is required by your procurement policy and review that everything is followed. Something to note, maintenance or upkeep items like oil or gasoline are not eligible material. We have addressed the aspect of cost, which include labor, equipment, and materials. Now let's look at fees paid, which is broken into two categories. First is mutual aid. If mutual aid was used in response to this event, it is important for both the requesting entity and providing entity to know what must take place to ensure a full reimbursement. The applicant is the requesting entity. They're the ones legally responsible for the work. The providing entity is the one assisting the requesting entity. There must be a mutual aid agreement in place between these two parties. The providing entity bills the requesting entity. The bill must include all supporting documentation for claim costs. Mutual aid activities include straight time and overtime labor, including fringe benefits, overtime for backfill of a deployed person's normal position, and equipment. The other side to fees paid is contracting. The preferred contract is a fixed-priced contract. This is the best contract to use for ensuring the agreement is in the applicant's best interest. The next contract is time and materials and is allowed when no other contract will serve its needs. It is only allowed for a short period of time and must have a cap price that if the contractor exceeds that cap, it'll be at their own cost. It also requires a high level of oversight and can only be used until the scope of work is clear enough to move into a fixed-priced contract. Cost plus percentage or percentage of construction is prohibited. There are no circumstances when the federal government allows this type of contracting. Regarding piggybacking, FEMA still discourages this type of contracting, as it is easy for the process to omit pertinent parts. However, this type of contracting is eligible, but there are two specific requirements that must be met. First, the entity that holds the contract must be able to prove compliance with federal procurement requirements. Second, the entity that wants to piggyback must be able to show where there is an allowable option in their pre-existing procurement policy. The last type of contract is the pre-existing contract. This can be an acceptable type of contract as long as it meets all of the procurement requirements involved in setting it up. When contracting, the documentation required includes, but is not limited to, the procurement policy, bid advertisement, and bid summary. The last category of eligible costs is management costs. They are calculated at 5% of all awarded projects, excluding donated resources. They're provided for the management of all awards in both direct and indirect costs. It does require documentation to support costs incurred, and it will not exceed the 5% provided. However, if less than 5% of the funds are used, the leftover funds are deobligated. A nice benefit to management costs is that they are 100% federal. There is no non-federal share match. You have the option to refuse management costs if you desire. It is not a mandatory award. Management costs will be the last project awarded because the award is based on all other awarded being processed first.